They said the sky would glow with hope when the call for help finally went out. The diplomats promised swift aid, calm negotiations, and a peaceful resolution. That was the dream the alien colonies held on to as their world trembled under threats they could no longer contain. But when the signal reached humanity, when that single desperate broadcast slipped through the cold, dark, what arrived was not a soft whisper of comfort. It was fire. It was thunder. It was the return of something the galaxy had almost forgotten, the roar of human dreadnoughts burning across the heavens in answer. At first, the colonists didn't understand what they were seeing. Their long-range sensors caught shapes moving through folded space, massive silhouettes tearing through the void with impossible velocity. The locals gathered on broken balconies and shattered towers, all waiting to hear the soothing tone of a rescue fleet or a diplomatic envoy. Instead, the night cracked open with a soundless flare, like the universe inhaling sharply before something ancient stepped through. And in that moment, every frightened eye turned upward, unsure whether salvation had come, or something far more dangerous. The colony leaders had expected negotiations. They had expected committees and quiet agreements sealed behind closed doors. After all, that was how the galaxy handled conflict slowly, carefully, with endless caution. But humanity had grown different. Stories of their past wars and their unmatched ships had become whispers across star systems, the kind spoken only when lights were dim. Many believed the stories were exaggerated. Others believed humans were unwilling to involve themselves again in another species' problems. No one believed the old tales that humans would cross half the spiral arm just to answer a plea from people they had never met. Yet here they were. The largest dreadnought broke formation first, drifting into orbit like a metal continent wrapped in shifting blue shields. It didn't broadcast a greeting or a warning. It simply hovered, watching, silent as judgment. Beneath it, the colony's command center erupted into frantic shouting. Officers scrambled to send coordinates, reports, anything that might explain their situation properly. They begged for aid, for medical supplies, for evacuation routes. They spoke of the threat rising on their horizon, the enemy that would soon tear their cities apart. They wanted clarity. They wanted promises. Humanity, however, was already moving. Inside the flagship, human crew members walked with grim focus, their boots echoing across polished metal floors. They weren't there for politics. They weren't there for negotiations. They were answering something deeper, an old instinct that had kept their species alive through centuries of conflict. Humanity didn't always step into galactic affairs, but when they did, it was never halfway. They had heard the desperation in that broadcast. They had heard fear. And humans had always had a habit of standing between fear and those who couldn't fight it alone. The colony civilians watched in silence as smaller human ships dove through the clouds like streaks of lightning. These vessels were faster than anything the locals had ever seen. They cut through the atmosphere without causing tremors or shockwaves, as if even the winds made room for them. The sight filled the people with something they hadn't felt in weeks, the fragile beginnings of hope. But hope soon mixed with confusion. The dreadnoughts weren't preparing evacuation ships. They weren't setting up relief camps. They were arming. Turrets unfolded like metal wings. Armor plates shifted. Energy reactors flared to life. The sky glowed red and gold as though dawn had come early and violently. The colonists could only stare, unsure if this was the beginning of their rescue or the beginning of a war far larger than they ever imagined. One elder whispered that humans never answered calls quietly. Another muttered that the galaxy had forgotten what humanity truly was when pushed to act. Some believed the humans had come not only to help, but to settle an old score one the colony leaders hadn't even known existed. Meanwhile, deep within the flagship's command deck, a single human officer studied the incoming threat on the holoscreen. The enemy force was larger than expected, far larger, and advancing faster than the colony could have ever reported. The officer's expression hardened, not with fear, but with the heavy calm of someone who had seen worse and walked away. Orders were given, shields recharged, weapons aligned. And just before the dreadnoughts shifted into full battle stance, the colony received their first message from the human fleet, a single sentence. A promise? And when the transmission cut out, every being on the planet felt the air tighten around them, because the humans were not preparing to flee, they were preparing to fight. What the colony didn't yet know, what the humans hadn't said, was who the enemy truly was, and why the Dreadnoughts had answered the call with fire rather than words. The sky brightened again. The battle hadn't started, but it was moments away. For a long moment, the colony remained frozen under the glow of the human Dreadnoughts. People stood in streets, on rooftops, in cracked plazas where dust still drifted from earlier tremors. They listened to the quiet hum rolling across the sky, a sound that felt far too calm for what everyone sensed was coming. The single message the humans had sent echoed in their minds, a promise without details, a warning without explanation. It was enough to steady some hearts, and unsettle others even more. Inside the colony's command tower, the leadership tried to regain control. Officers huddled around dim consoles, screens flickering in and out as power grids struggled to stay online. Questions filled the room. Why did the humans arrive so quickly? How did they cross such a distance in so little time? And why did they sound so certain, so ready, before even requesting a full report? No answer made sense. One junior analyst pulled up the last minutes of the broadcast they had sent, the call for help that traveled across star systems for weeks before finally reaching human territory. When she replayed it, she noticed something strange. There was an interference pattern layered over the message, like a faint pulse hidden behind their words. It wasn't from their equipment. It wasn't from the storm that had hit their planet that day. She enlarged the waveform. It looked almost like coordinates. Coordinates that pointed not to the colony, but to something near it. Before she could share her discovery, the floor trembled. Not from an attack, not from the approaching enemy. It came from above, a low vibration spreading through the city as the largest human dreadnought adjusted its orbit. Its engines barely flickered, yet the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The vessel was preparing for something. Far from the colony, in orbit space where sensors strained to track distant threats, the human fleet had already formed a layered defense line. They had positioned their dreadnoughts in a configuration the colony strategists had never seen. It wasn't a blockade, it wasn't a standard protective grid. It looked more like they were guarding something behind them, something invisible to everyone else. The humans weren't just here to protect the colony, they were here to confront whatever was coming, and whatever was hidden beyond it. In one of the colony shelters, a young technician watched the sky through a narrow blast window. He had heard old legends about humans, how they once stood alone against impossible odds, how their old warships were said to burn the heavens with their power. He thought those were exaggerations meant to impress children. But now, as he saw the human ships glimmer with rising energy, he wondered if the stories had actually been toned down rather than exaggerated. Around him, families whispered that perhaps the humans knew the enemy better than they had admitted. Some suggested that the humans weren't reacting, they had been waiting. And if they had been waiting, then something far bigger than the colony's crisis was unfolding. Meanwhile, inside the flagship's dimly lit command deck, the senior officers reviewed intelligence the colony had never seen. Data their own scanners couldn't capture. Records older than the colony itself. The approaching enemy force was not something random, not a wandering warband or a territorial rival. It was part of a pattern the humans had tracked for years quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. The enemy had destroyed worlds before. Small outposts, forgotten stations, fringe settlements. Every record showed the same thing, no survivors and no clear motive. Whenever the humans tried to investigate, the trail went cold. It was as if the attackers vanished back into the void, until now. This colony had become the next target, but the humans had intercepted fragments of the enemy's recent movements, fragments that hinted at something buried beneath the colony's surface. Something the colonists didn't even realize existed, and something the enemy wanted. The human officer studying the holoscreen knew this wasn't just a battle over territory. This wasn't simple aggression. There was a reason the interference pattern in the colony's distress call contained coordinates. Those coordinates weren't placed by the colonists. They were hidden within the signal, encoded by a source the humans had been tracking. Whatever was under the colony, it wanted to be found. Back on the surface, the junior analyst finally managed to get the attention of her commanding officer. She showed him the coordinates, the pulse, the strange pattern buried beneath their broadcast. But before she could explain further, an alert blared through the tower. The enemy fleet had dropped out of folded space. Dozens of signatures, then hundreds appearing on every scanner at once. The sky dimmed as their shadow fell across the upper atmosphere. But what unsettled the colony most wasn't the size of the enemy fleet, it was how the humans reacted. They weren't surprised. They weren't confused. They simply shifted positions, almost as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. The human dreadnoughts lit up, their surfaces glowing brighter as energy coursed through their armor. But even then, they didn't fire. They were holding, watching, calculating. And somewhere inside the flagship, the officer monitoring the buried coordinates realized the signal beneath the colony had started pulsing again. Faster, stronger, as if waking up, as if calling out to someone, maybe to the humans, maybe to the approaching enemy, maybe to something else entirely. No one on the planet knew what would emerge. And no one, not even the humans, knew what answering that hidden call would truly unleash. The enemy fleet spread across the upper sky like a dark curtain, blotting out stars one by one. Even at a distance, the colony could see their silhouettes, sharp, angular shapes that didn't look designed for anything but destruction. The colony's people braced for impact, expecting the human dreadnoughts to unleash their full firepower. Instead, the humans held their positions, silent and controlled, as if studying every movement the enemy made. Inside the colony's command tower, tension tightened the air. Officers spoke in hurried voices, trying to match the enemy signatures to anything in their databases. Nothing fit. Every known pattern was wrong. And what unsettled them even more was the calmness coming from the human fleet. They didn't seem surprised by the enemy at all. If anything, they seemed to be waiting for them to reveal their intentions. The junior analyst, still shaken from her discovery, kept glancing between the enemy readings and the coordinates hidden beneath their distress call. The pulsing signal beneath the planet had grown stronger, almost rhythmic now, like a heartbeat. The timing aligned too closely with the enemy's arrival to be a coincidence. She tried to raise the issue again with her superior, but a sudden surge in power flickered through the tower, disabling half the screens. Across the colony, citizens scrambled into shelters, guided by emergency broadcasts repeating the same instructions: stay indoors, stay low, avoid open ground. But many couldn't resist looking out windows or climbing rooftops to watch the distant standoff. Human dreadnoughts floated like massive steel guardians, their shields glowing faintly. The enemy ships hovered just beyond the atmosphere, atmospheric friction shimmering around their hulls. The space between the two fleets felt like a held breath. In an underground shelter, the technician who had watched the dreadnoughts arrive now listened to people whispering theories. Some said the humans had finally come to confront an old foe, one they'd been tracking across the galaxy. Others believed the humans were trying to protect something hidden on the colony, something so important they were willing to risk an all-out war. A few wondered whether the humans were not just responding to a call for help, but to a threat aimed at them. But no matter the theory, one truth held firm: the humans had come prepared. Back on the flagship, the senior human officer monitored the expanding enemy formation. He recognized the pattern: they always spread wide, taking up as much space as possible, testing responses. The officer noted every maneuver with a cold focus. These enemies weren't here to communicate. They never communicated, they struck, they consumed, they vanished. Yet this time, they hadn't attacked immediately. They were holding position, almost as if waiting for something beneath the colony to activate. The officer tightened his jaw. They were here for the same reason the humans were. Both sides had followed the same trail. Both had detected the same buried signal. The enemy wanted whatever was hidden below. The humans wanted to keep it out of their hands, and the colony? They were caught in the middle of a conflict older than their entire civilization. Deep below the planet's crust, seismic sensors registered faint movement shifts too precise to be natural. It was as if machinery older than the colony itself had started to stir. The analyst, now working from a backup console, expanded the waveform again. The coordinates were updating in real time. And for the first time, she saw a secondary detail, a symbol embedded in the pulse. She didn't recognize it, but she'd seen something similar on human research reports years ago, classified ones she had only glimpsed by accident while filing digital archives. It wasn't a colony symbol, it wasn't an enemy symbol. It was human in origin. But the humans never mentioned placing anything beneath the colony. That meant this wasn't something they hid here. It was something they once came looking for and never found. Meanwhile, the enemy ships dipped closer, inch by inch, testing the boundary. The atmosphere shimmered with rising static. The humans responded by shifting formation, dreadnoughts closing in tighter around the colony like a protective cage. Energy signatures rose across their hulls, turrets rotated. Engines rumbled. Still, no one fired. The enemy didn't fire because they were waiting. The humans didn't fire because they needed answers first. And the colony? They could do nothing but watch. Inside a distant shelter, an elderly colonist spoke softly to those around her. She remembered old record stories from her grandparents about a time when humans explored ancient ruins across the frontier. Stories about sealed vaults, forgotten archives, strange artifacts buried on once-abandoned worlds. She wondered whether their colony had been built over one of those forgotten places. Maybe humans had investigated long ago and left empty-handed, assuming they misread the signs. But perhaps the thing buried beneath them had never been dormant. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for the right conditions to wake up. Outside, the planet shook again, just a tremor, but enough to rattle hanging lights and send dust drifting from ceilings. People grabbed onto anything stable. The shaking wasn't violent. It was controlled, deliberate, like something deep below was adjusting its position. A new alert sounded from the human flagship. The officer's eyes narrowed. The buried signal had changed. It wasn't just pulsing now, it was transmitting. Not outward into space. Upward directly toward the human dreadnoughts. The officer knew then that it wasn't calling for the colony. It wasn't calling for the enemy. It was calling for humanity. But the humans didn't respond. They didn't send coordinates. They didn't send a message back. All they did was prepare to move. And overhead, the enemy fleet reacted to shifting suddenly, breaking formation, accelerating toward the planet as if something below had finally given them the sign they had been waiting for. The first shot still hadn't been fired, but the moment it would was seconds away. The enemy fleet broke its stillness the moment the buried signal reached full strength. Their ships tilted forward in unison, engines flaring with a cold, pale light that spread across their hulls like frost. Within seconds they began to descend, not in a chaotic rush, but in a precise, synchronized advance that chilled every colony resident who saw it. These were not raiders or opportunists. This was something far more organized, far more patient. The colony's shelters shook as alarms wailed through the underground halls. People clutched each other, listening as the broadcast repeated the same urgent message. Remain sheltered. Do not go outside. Human forces are engaging, but when citizens glanced at the battered screens showing the sky above, they saw something else. The humans still hadn't fired. Instead, the human dreadnoughts drifted, adjusting positions with slow, deliberate movements. They did not panic. They did not rush. They placed themselves exactly between the colony and the descending enemy layer of armor and shield forming a living wall of steel. Inside the flagship, the senior human officer stood rigid, eyes locked on the expanding threat. The buried signal below the colony had shifted again. It was no longer transmitting a call, it was forming a pattern, a map, a warning. And the more the pattern revealed, the more the officer understood why the enemy had come with such force. This wasn't a simple resource world. This wasn't an ordinary colony. This was the key to something the enemy had chased for decades, and something humanity had tried to forget. Deep in the command tower, the junior analyst worked to decode the symbol embedded in the pulse. She traced its shape again and again, comparing it to old human archives, until the realization hit her like a sudden drop. The symbol matched fragments from a long-discontinued human research project, something abandoned after mysterious losses on the frontier. a project that revolved around ancient structures buried under dead worlds. Structures that hummed with a strange energy humans never fully understood. Structures that humans once believed might be connected across star systems like a forgotten network. If this was one of those structures, then it had never been dead, and it had never been empty. The ground trembled again, heavier this time. Dust rained from ceilings. Power flickered. People grabbed children and held onto walls as vibrations rolled through the planet's crust like thunder trapped underground. Something below was waking. In the streets above, a handful of colony scouts who had stayed outside for visual confirmation hurried through abandoned plazas, shielding their faces from grit blowing through the rising wind. The sky above them darkened as both fleets shifted into formation. The scouts could see flashes, reflections from charging weapons, arcs of energy dancing across human hull plating, the faint glow gathering at the tips of enemy cannons. They ducked behind a shattered fountain as a burst of static cracked across the atmosphere. It wasn't a weapon. It was a warning shot. The enemy fired not at the colony, but at the human line. The humans didn't flinch. In the flagship, tension thickened around the officer as he monitored the readings. "They're not here for the colony," a junior crew member muttered behind him. "They're here for the structure?" "No," the officer said quietly. "They're here for what it will unlock." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. No one asked further. They already sensed the truth. The humans knew far more about this threat than they ever admitted. On the colony's lower levels, engineers scrambled to stabilize the power grid as seismic spikes interrupted circuits. Lights flickered again and again before stabilizing on emergency power. One engineer reported strange readings, currents flowing from deep underground toward the surface. Not natural currents, not geothermal. It was energy. Old energy. Artificial and structured. In a cramped stairwell, two colonists argued about whether the humans would actually hold the enemy back. One insisted humanity never entered a fight without certainty. The other said no species could withstand an army that size. Their voices fell silent as the ceiling above them vibrated hard enough to shake dust loose. A heavy rumble rolled through the colony. Somewhere above, something massive had moved, either the Dreadnoughts or the awakening structure. High in the atmosphere, the enemy ships suddenly widened their formation, curling around the human blockade like jagged wings. They didn't try to sneak past. They tried to surround the humans completely. Their energy signatures spiked to dangerous levels. The air grew warmer. Static crawled along the edges of buildings. This was the moment both sides had been waiting for. On the flagship bridge, the officer locked eyes with the tactical display. "Targeting solutions ready," a crew member reported in a steady voice. Another added, "Shields at full capacity." The officer nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. Still, he did not give the order to fire. The analyst, watching enemy movements from the colony tower, felt her pulse quicken. She realized the enemy was not attacking because they wanted to force the humans to fire first. They needed the Dreadnoughts distracted, engaged, and able to interfere with whatever would rise from the planet's depths. Below her feet, the ground shook again so violently that screens toppled. Loose equipment slid across floors, and several officers grabbed onto railings. This tremor wasn't like the others. It wasn't subtle or restrained. It was the first true awakening. The buried structure released a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through every building in the colony. Even the shelters heard it, felt it like a low voice speaking from beneath the world. Citizens looked upward. Soldiers braced themselves. The humans tightened formation. The enemy surged forward. The sky lit up with the first flare of charging weapons, human and enemy alike. Everyone could sense it now. The moment before everything broke, the thin line before war ignited, the breath before the heavens burned. And as the ancient hum grew louder, as the fleets closed the distance, as the colony trembled on the edge of a catastrophe it didn't understand, the first shot, the one that would decide everything, was seconds from being unleashed. The first shot never came. Just as both fleets reached the razor-thin edge of battle, the hum beneath the colony surged into a roar. Light thin, blinding, white burst from cracks in the ground across the planet. It shot toward the sky in narrow beams, piercing the atmosphere like rising pillars. Every human sensor went wild. Enemy formations broke rhythm. Even the dreadnoughts, steady and unshaken until now, shifted instinctively away from the erupting energy. The colony's people felt it in their bones. The shelters vibrated, dishes rattled, and every screen flashed warning after warning. No one knew what was happening, not even the humans. And that terrified the colony far more than the enemy fleet overhead. The junior analyst clung to her console as the tower shook. Her readings blurred with noise, but one thing stood out: something beneath the planet wasn't just awakening. It was unlocking. For a moment, she thought it was a weapon. But then she saw the symbols emerging within the signal shapes and patterns that didn't match any known language. They were shifting, forming, almost alive. She recorded every frame, heart pounding, because something deep inside her felt certain this was more than ancient machinery. It was a message, not from the enemy, not from the humans, from the structure itself. In orbit, the enemy ships suddenly halted their advance. Their engines flickered, stabilizing as if they were recalculating. They were sensing the same thing: something had changed. Many of their vessels tilted downward, scanning the planet instead of focusing on the human blockade. The pale glow of their hulls darkened, shimmering with new data pouring across their systems. Whatever they had come for was no longer hidden. It was rising. Inside the human flagship, the senior officer's calm finally cracked, not from fear, but from realization. He recognized fragments of the symbols blooming across the Dreadnoughts' holodisplays, old files, old warnings, lost projects humanity had buried because they didn't want to face what they meant. The structure wasn't just a relic. It was part of a network older than any recorded star map. A network humans once believed could bend entire regions of space, distort matter, shift time layers, manipulate gravitational boundaries. And now it was waking beneath a vulnerable colony. The officer issued rapid-fire commands. Human ships redirected power to deeper sensors, searching for the source of the beams. Dreadnoughts widened their stance again, not to attack, but to cover more of the sky in case something emerged from below. But before they could form a new defensive grid, the planet shook with enough force to knock surveillance drones out of the air. The ground split in several regions, but not into chaotic fractures. The breaks formed perfect geometric lines, shapes too precise to be natural. Entire streets and fields shifted, rising at angles that defied gravity before settling into new positions. Across the colony, people screamed, not because of destruction, but because the world itself felt like it was rearranging around them. In the abandoned plaza where the scouts hid, the ground before them opened like a slow, deliberate hinge. A vast circular plate rose from beneath the soil, smooth, polished, and humming with energy. The scouts backed away, eyes wide as the plate rotated with fluid grace, aligning itself with the beams heading toward orbit. It wasn't a weapon, it was a doorway. Not upward. Outward toward something just beyond normal space. The enemy fleet responded instantly. Their ships lunged forward, breaking their own formation as they rushed toward the shimmering beams. Their pale glow brightened again. Some of their vessels crackled with energy so intense the air around them warped. They were desperate. They needed to stop the door from opening. Human dreadnoughts moved to intercept, engines flaring. Smaller human strike ships shot between them, weaving through the beams with impossible precision. But even as they acted, it was clear both sides were too slow. The doorway kept expanding. Inside the colony command tower, the analyst stared at her screen as the symbol sequence completed itself. For a brief moment, it formed a stable pattern, a sigil. She didn't recognize it, but the human databases did. Her system lit up with urgent flags. It was a warning marker used by ancient human research teams. Unstable gate, not safe. Do not activate. Her breath caught. They didn't mean the colony isn't safe, she whispered. They meant the gate isn't. The officer in the human flagship was thinking the same thing. He watched the doorway ripple, each pulse bending the space around it. Gravity distorted across the battlefield. Enemy ships swayed violently as their stabilizers failed to compensate. Even the dreadnoughts groaned under the strain. This wasn't just a gate, it was a rupture. One that could tear apart anything caught in its wake. But before anyone could act, the doorway flared brighter than the sun. The shadows of both fleets stretched across the colony. The enemy pushed harder, engines screaming, intent on reaching the gate first. Humans moved to block them, knowing if the enemy reached the structure, the consequences would spread far beyond this one world. And then something else happened. A third signal appeared, not from the structure. Not from the humans, not from the enemy. It came from the other side of the doorway. A deep, resonant pulse that matched nothing in known galactic records. The analyst froze. The officer froze, the enemy fleet froze, because whatever was answering was alive, and it was coming through. The pulse that came through the doorway struck the battlefield like a silent shockwave. No light, no sound. Just a pressure that pressed into every mind, every hull, every sensor at once, human, enemy, and colony alike. For a moment, everything paused. Even the trembling ground beneath the colony seemed to still, as if the planet itself was listening. Inside the human flagship, the officer felt the breath catch in his chest. His screens flickered with readings that defied logic, energy signatures, shifting into patterns that didn't match any known species or technology. Yet something about them felt familiar, like a memory buried deep inside ancient human archives. The doorway widened, warping space around it, and a silhouette began to form. Not a ship, not a creature. Something in between, shapeless and shifting, like a being made of light wrapped in its own gravitational field. Its presence bent the stars behind it, making the sky ripple like water. The enemy fleet reacted instantly. They surged toward the gate at full speed, their pale hulls blazing. It was clear now they didn't come to claim the structure. They came to stop whatever was coming through. Their desperation made sense at last. Human dreadnoughts intercepted them, weapons firing in bright bursts that lit up the sky. Shockwaves rippled across orbit as the two forces clashed. The enemy fought with a frantic energy, each ship lunging forward even as human beams tore into their sides. The humans didn't fight with the same fury, they fought with precision, every shot aimed to halt the enemy, not destroy them. Because for the first time since the battle began, humanity understood the enemy wasn't here to conquer the colony. They were here to prevent something far worse. On the ground, the junior analyst stared at the rising readings, her stomach twisting. The being emerging from the gate wasn't simply alive, it was aware. Its pulse changed rhythm when the humans fired. It shifted when the enemy advanced. It responded to them both, like something intelligent trying to determine which side was the greater threat. The scouts in the plaza watched as the circular plate beneath them glowed brighter, its patterns swirling like fluid metal. The air above it twisted, forming a swirling funnel that connected the gate to the planet. They backed away cautiously, unsure whether they were witnessing the birth of a miracle or a disaster. The energy beams from the sky intensified as the fleets collided. Human dreadnoughts fired full volley barrages, pushing the enemy back inch by inch, but the enemy didn't stop. They pushed harder, engines screaming under the strain. Several ships overloaded and detonated in bursts of pale fire, but not a single vessel tried to flee. Inside the human flagship, a message flashed across the officer's console, a signal decoded from the enemy transmissions. It wasn't complex. It wasn't a language. Just 3 repeating patterns the humans had never understood before. Now, with the gate active, the officer finally understood. Contain, prevent, seal. The enemy had been chasing these ancient structures across the galaxy, not to unlock them, but to stop them. They weren't conquerors. They were guardians of a threat too old for anyone else to remember. The officer turned to his crew. "We cannot let that thing come through," he said, voice steady. "Prepare the planetary disruptor sequence?" The crew froze. Everyone knew what that meant. The dreadnoughts carried weapons capable of collapsing unstable forms of space. Firing such a weapon at the gate would destroy the structure and everything near it, including part of the colony, including any chance of understanding what the being was. But before the order could be confirmed, the analyst broke through the comms, voice trembling. "Wait, don't destroy it yet." Her image flickered onto the flagship screen. "The signal, it changed. It's not hostile, it's searching," the officer frowned. "Searching for what?" She hesitated, then said, "Us. Humanity, it's calling us by pattern, not the colony. Not the enemy, US. On the battlefield, the being fully breached the gate. Its form expanded, swirling into a shape that resembled a massive winged arc of light. Its presence hit the fleets with another pulse, this one warm, almost curious, and that was when everything shifted. The being turned not toward the colony, not toward the humans, but toward the enemy fleet. Its form sharpened, its energy spiked. And the enemy ships, for the first time in the entire conflict, recoiled in fear. The humans realized the truth too late. The enemy wasn't trying to stop the being from harming the colony. They were stopping it from escaping. The being surged forward in a burst of crackling light, and the first row of enemy ships disintegrated instantly. No explosion, no wreckage, just gone. The enemy fleet broke apart in panic. The humans braced for impact. The analysts stared at the readings, heart racing. And then the being stopped. Its form hovered between the two fleets. It shifted its gaze toward the human dreadnoughts. A pulse rippled outward, gentle, almost like a greeting. But beneath that greeting was something else. A code. A message. A sequence that matched ancient human research logs. The officer's eyes widened. It wasn't here to destroy. It wasn't here to conquer. It was here to return. The being pulsed again. And every human dreadnought responded with the same symbols automatically, as if they had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The enemy fleet accelerated in panic. The colony watched helplessly. And in the final instant before the being made contact with the human flagship, the entire battlefield went white. The silenced heavens slowly settled after everything that had happened, as if the galaxy itself needed a moment to breathe. The scattered embers of the last battle flickered against distant clouds of dust, their glow fading into the dark. Humanity's dreadnoughts drifted in slow formation, no longer burning through enemy lines, no longer shaking entire systems with their arrival. For the first time since the conflict had begun, the fleet lights dimmed not in defeat, but in a long exhale of relief. Yet, even in that quiet, the weight of the choice they had made hung heavy over everyone. "It does," the commander replied, though the tone remained heavy. "But the galaxy will remember how we did it." Outside, repair drones circled the dreadnought hulls, patching the deep burns and torn plating. The sight should have been reassuring, but all it did was remind them of how close they came to losing everything. Even the flagship bore marks from the final assault, glowing faintly where the metal had been heated beyond safe limits. Humanity had pushed every limit they had: technology, strategy, and spirit. They had given everything, and the cost was written across the sky. Inside the ship, the quiet halls slowly filled with movement again. Medical staff rushed to stabilize injured crew, engineers checked damaged systems, and communications officers relayed messages from the surviving colonies. Everywhere, the same question traveled from one voice to another. What happens now? Some worlds were already calling humanity their protectors. Others were calling them a threat. The Dreadnoughts' sudden return had changed the balance of the stars in a single sweep, and no council or coalition could ignore that. The crew knew the political waves would come soon, spreading out like ripples from a stone dropped into deep water. But for now, they allowed themselves to breathe. Far below, the rescued world slowly lit up as power grids were restored. Lights flickered on across cities that had been dark for weeks. People were stepping outside again, staring up at the sky where human ships floated like silent guardians. A few even raised their hands, waving at the distant silhouettes that had saved them. The crew watched this from orbit, some smiling, some wiping quiet tears, some simply processing the reality that their actions had meant life for countless strangers.